Okay, good morning, everyone. Let's go ahead and get started. So, the topic for the day is part two of our three-part series on the mind and consciousness. Last time we covered theories of dualism. We covered Descartes' theory of substance dualism and what's known as property dualism. And the philosopher we looked at, who's a representative of property dualism, was David Chalmers. Today, we're going to switch gears and look at materialist theories of mind. Before we get started, let's do the attendance question for the day. And the attendance question is this: is it possible for advanced computers, either now or in the future, to experience the same subjective mental states that we do? So go ahead and post your response to this in the discussion forum for this topic. Remember that the topics now are kind of below the fold of the first page, so you'll need to hit show all to find the discussion forum for this topic. Try to do that by the end of the day if you can. So is it possible for advanced computers, now or in the future, to experience the same subjective mental states that we do? This is the fundamental question of artificial intelligence, right? Is genuine artificial intelligence possible? Not just simulations of intelligence, not just intelligent chatbots, not just quasi-intelligent robots that are basically walking zombies, but genuinely intelligent, conscious computers. Okay, so go ahead and chew on that while we're diving in. Really quickly, as a refresher, I want to give a quick overview of the different theories of consciousness, just the lay of the land. Last time we talked about dualism, and remember, dualism is the view that there's a substantive, qualitative difference between mind and body. Substance dualists hold that the mind and body, or the mind and the brain, are two different kinds of substances. Descartes thought there were non-physical thinking substances. Our minds are our souls, what he called a res cogitans, or a thinking thing, and that's distinct from our brains and anything else in the physical world, which he called res extensa, extended things, things that take up space and time and have all of the physical properties that natural scientists tell us about. He thought they were just two different things and somehow they were conjoined together and interact with each other. Property dualism, by contrast, doesn't hold that the mind and body are two different substances, that they hold that there's really one kind of substance. And really, we're talking about what's going on inside the brain. But that brain, which is essentially a physical thing, a physical object in the world, like any other object in the world, a complex thing, albeit, has two different kinds of properties. It has lower level physical properties, like the kinds of things you can measure with science, its dimensions and its mass and the structure of its neural networks and so on, electrical impulses, whatnot. But it also has higher level mental properties, intentionality and thoughts and feelings and subjective awareness and consciousness. But it's the same object that has two different kinds of properties. It's not that there are two different objects or two different substances conjoined together. And we talked about some of the advantages and disadvantages of that last time. If you weren't here last time and you want a refresher, make sure you watch the video from the last class. And if you're watching this on YouTube, make sure you find it in the playlist. So that's dualism. Dualism is distinguished from monism. Monism, as the name implies, is the view that there's only one kind of substance, not two different kinds of things. A view that has come up in the history of philosophy that we looked at last time is idealism. Not a very popular view. It's basically the view that anything that looks like it's physical substance, anything that seems like it's matter, the entire external world, in other words, is really just an idea. And we looked at two philosophers who were idealists. We looked at George Berkeley and we looked at Kant. And of course, Kant we covered earlier in the class, who's known as a transcendental idealist, because he thought that the external world that we live in is essentially a world that's constructed by our minds. But he still held that there's some deeper metaphysical reality, what he called things in themselves, underlying all of it. Both of those are a type of idealism. And today we're going to look at materialism, or what's known as physicalism. Again, there's some subtle differences between materialism and physicalism that we're just going to hand wave and gloss over for the purpose of this discussion. And in the 20th century philosophy of mind, there have really been three main physicalist theories, what's known as identity theory, behaviorism, and functionalism. And we looked at these a little bit in our last class session as well. I'll give a really quick definition of these, but I want to dive into some detail on these theories and talk about some of their strengths and weaknesses as it relates to trying to give an adequate account of consciousness and everything we want from philosophy of mind. Before we dive in, I want to give an overview just really quickly of what we kind of want from philosophy of mind. I think this is the kind of thing that is so obvious to us in our day-to-day experience. Obviously, we're conscious. Obviously, we have subjective experience. Obviously, we have a mental life. But we take that for granted so much that we forget how mysterious that really is, how unique it is in the natural world. If you look at the entire natural world around us, animals aside, tables and chairs and atoms and molecules, and out in the cosmos, you've got stars and galaxies. Presumably, none of those things are conscious. They don't have subjective experience. They don't, it's not like anything to be a galaxy, or it's not like anything to be a star. It's not like anything to be a molecule. But it is like something to be a human being who's conscious. And it might be like something to be an animal that has consciousness in some way that that they presumably have, but we don't fully understand. So one of the fundamental questions of philosophy of mind is, how exactly is consciousness possible in a natural world that otherwise doesn't seem to have consciousness? Somehow, consciousness is part of this world that we're in. It's part of our lives. We're in the natural world as much as anything else is part of the natural world, and yet we seem to be conscious, and we seem to have subjective experience and awareness in a way that other entities, other naturalistic, materialistic, physicalistic entities in the universe, in the cosmos, don't seem to have. So that's one big mystery. And then I think the other thing we want to preserve some sort of interaction between the two. I think a central part of our worldview is that we have free will. We, our minds, our consciousness, have the ability to cause our bodies to do things. Every time I make a decision, presumably what's going on is that there's a causal interaction between those mental properties, or that subjective experience, that consciousness, and the effects that happen in the natural world, the things my body does as a result of this decision that started, yes, in my brain, but also in my consciousness. So we want to preserve some notion of free will, because if we don't, we lose a lot. We lose a lot of our sense of selves, our personal identity. We lose our ability to hold people morally responsible for things, at least consistently. A lot of our worldview hinges on the fact that there's some sort of causal interaction between mind and body, between the mental realm and the physical realm. It could turn out that that's an illusion, right? It could be that there is no free will, and it's entirely deterministic, and things that look like they're free decisions, things that look like they're actions in the world that started from a decision that someone made in their mental lives, is really illusory, and there's no actual free will. That really could be the solution at the end of the day. But I think that's something we want to try to preserve, because if we go that direction, we lose a lot of our worldview. We lose a lot of our sense of self. We lose a lot, I would say, politically, in terms of how society should be structured. We lose a lot morally and ethically and whatnot. So there are lots of reasons to hold on to this notion of free will, and to try to preserve that in light of everything that science has learned about the natural world. And as the natural sciences progressed from the Enlightenment onward, this kind of quasi-deterministic view emerged that all of the natural world was governed by what's called billiard ball-like causation, things bumping into each other, balls knocking into each other on a table, and molecules bumping into each other, interacting with each other in very deterministic ways. And if the entire natural world is deterministic, there's a real problem. What room is there for free will? How can our minds cause something to happen in the natural world that's governed otherwise by deterministic natural laws? Now, in the 20th century, science backpedaled on that a little bit with the rise of quantum mechanics and indeterminacy, and it looks like the natural world maybe isn't as deterministic as was held from the 17th and 18th and 19th centuries onward. And that's an open question even in physics today. So those are the things that I think philosophy of mind really is most concerned with. How do you explain consciousness given that the natural world otherwise doesn't seem to be conscious? And then how do you preserve some notion of interaction between mind and body to preserve this notion of free will, to preserve all these things about ourselves and about the world and our role in causing things to world that are fundamental parts of our worldview? So it's very easy to kind of dismiss philosophy of mind as not important. Well, obviously consciousness is part of the natural world. Obviously we're here and we're part of the natural world. So what exactly is the problem? But I think there's a mystery of consciousness, how exactly subjective awareness and subjective perception, consciousness and self-awareness arise in a natural world at a very fundamental level, the level that physicists and chemists and microbiologists tell us about. the world that they describe in those sciences don't seem to account for a world that has subjective experience in it. At a certain point, complex entities emerge like brains and they yield consciousness. But that's mysterious given the unconscious nature, presumably at the lowest level of reality. And then, of course, trying to preserve free will. So I want you to kind of reflect on the mystery of consciousness. And this is something that has, every once in a while, I catch myself surprised by this. Like, wow, I'm here. I'm in the world. I'm conscious. Somehow here in this, it's spatially located here in the natural world, I'm a conscious being and I'm self-aware, unlike every other inanimate object around me, and maybe even unlike lower life forms like bacteria or the viruses that are making the news these days. So dwell on the mystery a little bit. And I think if you do, you'll start to realize why exactly this is a philosophical problem. But you have to overcome the hump of taking consciousness for granted as an obvious, ordinary feature of the world that we experience. So just as a refresher, I want to give you a little bit of the lay of the land. This is from last time as well, but I want to make sure you understand the structure of the discussion. There are various theories of consciousness out there. The two big distinctions are dualism or monism. Within dualism, you have substance dualism and property dualism, the theories that we looked at last time. Within monism, you've got idealism, the view that everything is mental, and materialism or physicalism, the view that everything is material. Everything is basically matter in the world, physical properties in the world. In the history of philosophy, dualism was the most popular view. You can see it in Plato, you can see it in Descartes, and you can see it in lots of other philosophers. Idealism had its day in the sun as well. One way of reconciling the difference is to say, well, everything is mental. You can actually see a little bit of this in Plato too, insofar as everything in the natural world are imperfect copies of ideal forms. But you can see it in Berkeley and Kant as well. But in the 20th century, with the rise of neuroscience and really the great success in the natural sciences, material science, what's called the natural sciences or natural philosophy from Galileo and Copernicus through Newton, through Descartes, even all the way into the 20th century. Materialism became the most popular view, that the only things that exist are natural, physical, material things in the world. And then the challenge is how to explain consciousness, how to explain subjective experience in completely naturalistic, materialistic, physical terms. And this circle here is largely the project of 20th century philosophy of mind. And I think we're starting to see the cracks in that today. There's been a resurgence in the last 20 or 30 years of philosophers who want to, again, emphasize the qualitative difference between the mental and the physical, kind of seeing the inability of any of these materialistic theories to adequately explain why these qualitatively different phenomena like consciousness and intentionality emerge out of the natural world. So that's the lay of the land. So today we're going to be focusing almost entirely on materialism and physicalism, these three theories here. The three big theories inside materialism are identity theory, behaviorism, and functionalism. Okay, next slide. Oop, actually went one too far. Here we go. So the first theory I want to look at is what's called identity theory. I mentioned this last time, but this is essentially the simplest type of materialist theory you can have. As the name implies, it's basically setting up an identity between the mental and the physical. And by identity, I want you to think about this mathematically. If two things are identical, like in mathematics or in algebra, if you had A equals A, what you're really saying is those are not just similar, they're the same exact thing. And that's what identity holds. There aren't two things to reconcile. Anytime we're talking about something mental, that is literally identical to something physical. There aren't two different things to reconcile. There aren't two different things to explain the relationship between the mental realm and the physical realm, or mental states and physical states, or mental properties and physical properties are literally just the same things. You can see immediately why this would be attractive. If there aren't two different things, mind and body, or the mental realm and the physical realm, or mental properties and physical properties, if there literally aren't two different things, then the problem collapses and goes away, right? You don't have to explain why something qualitatively different emerges from the natural world if the seemingly emergent thing just is identical to things in the natural world. The way this is usually described is in terms of mental states and brain states. So for example, if you have a certain mental state, like being in pain, that's a type of mental state. What an identity theorist would say is that that is identical to some brain state. And of course, this is the realm of neuroscience, right? It's up to the neuroscientist to tell us what exact brain state correlates to which type of mental states. But that's the idea. What it means to be in pain is to have a certain brain state or have a certain event occur inside the brain. I think right off the bat, you can see the potential problem with this view. It sure seems like the experience, the qualitative experience, the phenomena of being in pain isn't identical to anything inside the brain. The brain has things like neural structures, C fibers firing. That's the what correlates to pain in the actual world, it seems. But those descriptions of events in the brain and brain states seem qualitatively different than the experience of being in pain. So it's an attractive view because it collapses the problem. It basically tries to do an end run around the entire problem and say that anything that's seemingly mental just is something going on inside the brain. But in doing so, it tends to ignore the qualitative experience of the mental state in question. And that is going to be the fundamental problem with all of these materialist theories. That's why materialism was so promising, because it seemed like it seemed like a genuine way to get around this problematic distinction between the mental and the physical that basically Descartes set up in his Meditations. And neuroscience in the 20th century has been incredibly successful, and right up to this day in the 21st century, neuroscientists are still getting really good at correlating certain events in the brain with certain kinds of mental phenomena. But in saying that the mental phenomena are identical to the physical phenomena, you run the risk of ignoring the qualitative difference about the mental subjective experience of those phenomena. So there are two varieties of identity theory. So that simplistic way of describing identity theory is a little overly simplistic. There are two main varieties of identity theory, what's known as type identity and token identity. And this is another one of these instances where the philosophical terms maybe get in the way of understanding what's going on here. The distinction between a type and a token, this is just a fancy way of saying an entire category of mental experiences and brain states versus particular instances of a particular subjective experience and a particular brain state or particular brain event. It basically boils down to the problem of universals, the problem of the one and the many that we've talked about since the very beginning of class. Type identity basically says this: for any given category of mental experiences, the entire category of being in pain, or the entire category of intentionality, or the entire category of, pick your favorite mental state, like desire, for example, that would be identical to an entire category of brain states, a category of events in the brain. So the two things being equated aren't particular instances, but they're entire categories of mental events and physical events, brain states and mental states. I think the heart of this is that we don't just want to say that each person has his or her own brain states and each person has his or her own mental experiences. There are types of mental experiences. When I'm in pain or when you're in pain, there's something in common with those. They're the exact same kind of qualitative experience. In the same way that two different squares or two different triangles have something in common. They seem to participate in this general quality of being a square or being a triangle, the kind of thing that Descartes said when he was talking about ideal forms. So certain mental states seem to have something in common, and certain brain states seem to have something in common. So what identity says is you take the entire set or category of a certain mental state, being in pain or any other mental state, and you identify that with an entire set or an entire category of brain states or brain events. And that it's the categories that are being equated together. And that's attractive because it lets you talk about commonality between different people's brain states and mental states, right? Different people can, despite the differences in the neurophysiology, can be in pain or have desire or have intentionality or be self-aware, or make a decision, whatever the mental state is and whatever the brain states are. You can talk about commonality between them. That's as opposed to token identity. And a token is just a particular instance. So for example, just to bring this back to a simple example, we're talking about the nature of a square. The individual instance of a square, like a square drawn here, and if I kind of outline a square with my finger for you guys, or I draw a square on a piece of paper, or any other square-like thing out in the world, each of those individual instances would be a token of a square. But the general qualities of a square would be more like a type, the overall category of squares. I hope that example makes the distinction between types and tokens clear for you guys. But when you hear token, just think in a particular individual instance. So if I'm in pain, that would be a token of pain. And if you're in pain, that would be a token of pain, a particular instance of that kind of subjective experience. And brain states have tokens as well. Whatever's happening in my brain when I'm in pain, that would be a token of a brain state. And whatever's happening in your brain when you're in pain, that would be a different token of a brain state. So what token identity says, it basically says for any given particular instance, a particular instance of pain or any other mental state, and a particular instance of a brain state, it's the tokens that are being equated together. So for any given mental state, a token of a mental state, not a general category, not a universal quality, but a particular mental state by a particular conscious being, that is identical to a particular brain event or brain state inside that individual. Are there any questions about that before I dive in to talk about some of the strengths and weaknesses of this view?
No.
Okay, let's go ahead and move on then. A related concept that affects whether or not identity theory is an adequate theory is what's known as multiple realizability. And again, I feel like I have to apologize for throwing some of these terms out there because I really don't like the terms. I think the terms get in the way of understanding the basic idea. But this is the term, multiple realizability. And it means this: a mental property is multiply realizable if it can be instantiated by different types of underlying physical systems. So before we look at some examples, think about humans now. If I can be in pain and you can be in pain, we have something in common, right? It's the exact same kind of mental property that's being instantiated by two different brains, right? My brain and your brain, if I'm in pain and you're in pain. Or all of you guys, if we were in pain collectively together, right? That same mental property, thinking now more like a type identity theorist, would be instantiated by a bunch of different people all at the same time, or asynchronously if it's at different times. But the interesting question is, can that same quality, that same mental state, be instantiated by even different kind of beings? Do other life forms here on Earth also have pain? Like literally right now outside my window, there's a bird at the bird feeder. If that bird is in pain, is that bird instantiating the very same mental property, the property of being in pain, even though its neurophysiology is radically different from a human being's? If so, that means that pain is multiply realizable. It's able to be instantiated and generated and created, for lack of a better word, by a number of different kinds of physical systems. And I think this is the idea. I think the core idea behind neuroscience in general is that physical systems like a brain instantiate mental properties. So whatever pain is, it's being generated by what's going on inside my brain. And then the question is, can that same subjective experience of pain be instantiated not just by different people, but by a number of potentially radically different physical systems? If so, that mental property is called multiply realizable. It really could be, and we don't know because we're not animals, right? We're not other life forms. It really could be that only humans experience pain and no other life form experiences pain in the way we do, even if they exhibit some of the behaviors of being in pain. If not, if it really is only our particular kinds of brains that instantiate pain, then pain would not be multiply realizable. It would be realizable only by a particular kind of neurophysiology, or a particular kind of physical substrate, as it's called. So what does this mean? For any given mental state, like pain or intentionality or pleasure or desire or making a decision, or pick your favorite mental experience, are those mental states and mental phenomena instantiated, able to be instantiated by a number of different kinds of life forms? Can they be instantiated by other life forms even here on Earth? Pain is just an easy example, so let's keep using pain. But can birds experience pain? Can other kinds of mammals like whales and dolphins experience pain? Can insects crawling on the ground experience pain? Can bacteria experience pain? Life form by life form by life form, you can go, it's an interesting question. Presumably the higher life forms experience something like pain, or at least they exhibit the behaviors of pain. But even bacteria, if you poke and prod them in the right way, they'll kind of back off, like they have their own defensive systems. So do they experience pain as well? So exactly how multiply realizable certain kinds of mental phenomena are is an open question. Maybe it's a question we'll never adequately be able to answer because we don't know what it's like to be other life forms. There's a famous article called "What's It Like to Be a Bat?" A bat has a radically different kind of sensory experience, right? It uses sonar and echolocation to navigate its way around, very different from the way that humans navigate around their way around the world. So it's an interesting question. What is it like to be that kind of creature? Not just imagining ourselves being that creature, but what is it like for a bat to be a bat? What are the subjective experiences? What phenomena does it experience? How do those phenomena differ from the kinds of phenomena that humans experience? Presumably, bats experience pain as well, but is it the same kind of pain? Is it the same kind of quality? Or is it something qualitatively different than human pain to be a bat and experience pain? So it's an interesting question, even for other life forms here on Earth. And I think we take for granted that other animals experience pain. But I guess my point is that's not obvious at all, that the way a bat experiences pain, or the way a dolphin experiences pain, or the way a higher primate experiences pain, or the way an insect experiences pain, or the way a bacterium experiences pain. It's not obvious at all that that's the exact same mental phenomena. It might be, it might not be. That's the interesting question. Of course, we can extend the discussion to other kinds of life forms. Our alien life forms, if there are any out there elsewhere in the universe, if they have a potentially radically different neurology than ours, different structures in their equivalent of a brain, whatever that would be, do they experience pain as well? And it's the same question as the relationship between a human and an insect. If there's a question about that, imagine a radically different kind of life form out there in the universe with a very different neurophysiology. Does that being experience the same kind of pain, even though the physical substrate generating that property might be radically different? You can even extend this to other kinds of life. There's an interesting question in astrobiology, whether other kinds of life forms, like silicon-based life forms instead of carbon-based life forms, are possible and exist. If so, can they experience pain even though their entire neurophysiology is based on a different chemical system than the carbon system that's used to that underlies all of life on Earth? Encoding genetic information in silicon instead of DNA. If that's possible, if they're set up and arranged the right way, if they're complex enough, like our neurophysiology is complex enough, can silicon-based life forms experience pain or intentionality or self-awareness or any of the other qualities that we've been talking about as it relates to our mental lives as human beings? And of course, here in the actual world, for us today, it's an interesting question whether self-aware computing systems are possible. If it's possible for a computing system, maybe not today, because computing systems, however advanced they are, aren't as advanced as our brain, aren't as complex as our brain. In the future, is it in principle possible for computing systems to become self-aware? Will computing systems be genuinely conscious, genuinely self-aware, potentially experiencing things like pain and intentionality and pleasure and all of the mental phenomena that we seem to experience as conscious beings? I think that's the hard problem of artificial intelligence. And while we're talking about it, I think it's actually unfortunate that the term artificial intelligence is thrown around so willy-nilly. Any kind of machine learning where a machine seems to learn complex behaviors or adapt its behaviors based on situations, or learn to modify its own behavior based on inputs and outputs, is called artificially intelligent. And I think that doesn't do justice to what we want from artificial intelligence. For us, it's not enough just to be walking zombies with no subjective awareness. It's not enough to process inputs and outputs. We have subjective experience. We have consciousness and self-awareness, and we experience things subjectively, pain or pleasure or intentionality or otherwise. And so the interesting question is not, can we develop a computer system that emulates all of that, but is there a computer system that's possible that is genuinely self-aware, genuinely conscious, and genuinely experiences all of these subjective first-person phenomena that we experience as conscious beings? And we'll talk about that more in a few minutes. But that's called multiple realizability. And getting back to identity theory now, type identity seems to handle this fairly well. If you have an entire set of mental properties, like the properties of being in pain, then you have to equate that to something. What is that identical to? Well, obviously in humans, it's identical to a certain kind of brain event. And just to talk about pain again, because this is the easy one to talk about, a type identity theorist would say, well, pain, the general quality of being in pain, the general set of experiences of pain, is identical to a certain type of brain state, basic or brain event. C fibers firing is how it works in humans. When your C fibers fire, you're in pain. Now, if you relate that to multiple realizability, I think you can see the problem with this view, right? If it turns out that other kinds of beings besides humans, beings that don't have C fibers, excuse me, beings that have some other kind of brain structure or some other kind of neurophysiology, if they're also able to experience the exact same phenomena of pain, you can see why equating pain with C fibers firing is not going to be adequate to explain what pain is. You'd have to extend your definition. And sometimes this is done in terms of what's called a disjunction. And this is kind of, it's not a very fruitful way to extend the definition. It's kind of an ad hoc extension of the theory. You know, if it turns out that intelligent aliens exist and they don't have C fibers, maybe that they have some other kind of brain structure. Just for the sake of convenience, let's call it X fibers. Suppose they're intelligent aliens and they have X fibers instead of C fibers, and their X fibers fire to create pain instead of our C fibers firing to create pain. Then you'd have to say something like this. Well, pain equals, yes, C fibers firing or X fibers firing. And it could be a very long disjunction. If there's other kinds of life forms that don't even have C fibers or X fibers, if they have D fibers or E fibers or something totally different, you'd have to say something like this. Pain is C fibers firing for humans, or X fibers firing for intelligent aliens, or D fibers firing for insects, and you can end up with this incredibly long kind of ad hoc disjunction of types of physical substrates to generate pain. And I think the criticism is just this. That looks like a really hacked together, sloppily arranged definition of pain, right? It fails to grasp the things that pain has in common by basically spelling it out in terms of a bunch of either ors. Pain is this for humans, or pain is this for aliens, or pain is this for insects. It doesn't really unify pain into the coherent whole that you want it to be. So that's how identity theory would handle multiple realizability. Another way to go, just getting back to the identity theory slide, if you're a token identity theorist, in a way the problem kind of goes away. There is no universal definition of pain. There is no broad category of pain. If all you have are tokens, if all you have are particular instances, if I say, you know, I've got my pain and that's identical to something in my brain, and you, fellow human, are in pain and that's a token of pain, and that's identical to some brain event in your brain, some token of a brain event, and that's how it works for you. And if there's intelligent aliens, then there's a token of pain that the intelligent alien has, and that token of pain is identical to some brain event inside that alien brain. And that's how pain works for that creature, and so on and so forth for every individual creature that experiences pain. In a way, that dismisses the problem, because it basically says that there is nothing to be multiply realizable. There is no general definition of pain. There is no general set of mental properties or physical properties to equate. All you have are particular instances. But I think what that does is fail to grasp that we do seem to have things in common. If I'm in pain and you're in pain, and if intelligent aliens are in pain, and orangutans and chimpanzees are in pain, and whales and dolphins are in pain, and insects and intelligent aliens are all in pain, there's presumably something in common. It's the same kind of quality, the same phenomena, the same subjective experience, the same sensations seem to be experienced by all those different creatures. So it sure looks like there is something in common from instance of pain to instance of pain to instance of pain that token identity theory doesn't seem to be able to take into account. It doesn't seem to explain why my pain and your pain and alien pain and insect pain and dolphin pain are all the same kind of pain. So it is a way to go. It kind of dismisses the problem, but it also fails to grasp that there does seem to be some general qualities to these mental states. And that's what allows us to discuss. If I'm in pain and you're in pain and other creatures are in pain, we can empathize with each other, we can talk about it, we can describe it, we can relate to each other. The reason we can do all those things is presumably that my experience of pain and your experience of pain and the experience of pain of birds outside my window is there's something in common, something that's shared in all those experiences that token identity theory doesn't seem to be able to explain. If all there are is tokens and no general quality of being in pain or no general similarity to the underlying substrates and how those substrates generate the mental phenomena in question. Let's move on. So that's multiple realizability. I think you can see the problem with identity theory. It's really hard for identity theory to explain the emergence of anything qualitatively mental, right? The subjective experience at all. If all we have are brain states, why do we get subjective experience arising out of that? Even if they're literally the same thing, they sure don't seem like they're the same thing on the surface. And it kind of hand waves on and dismisses the subjective experience as unimportant, emphasizing the physical qualities and physical events going on in the brain at the expense of recognizing the qualitative difference of subjective phenomena. It basically says subjective phenomena, all those are as brain states. So let me back up here again. Anytime identity theorists talk about mental states, if it's the mental state of being in pain or pleasure or desire or being self-aware, whatever it is, all of those mental states, again, literally are just brain states. Even if it's a complex disjunction of different kinds of brain states, it's still just brain states. So I think an identity theorist is forced to say that all we have, anything that's seemingly qualitatively different, yes, we talk about subjective phenomena. Yes, it seems like we experience subjective phenomena. We have this rich vocabulary that we use to talk about our mental lives, right? The way I talk about feelings and intentions and beliefs and all the things that make up my mental life. And you do the same thing with your mental lives in unique ways, in ways that are unique to you as an individual. It's what makes us, beautiful, unique snowflakes and interesting people. But the fact that we have this rich vocabulary for describing those things, in some sense, for an identity theorist, is illusory. They would basically say that there aren't two things to describe. There aren't two different kinds of qualities. If we're talking about the experience of pain, if I'm describing what it feels like to be in pain, in fact, I burned myself this morning. I have this little coffee mug warmer that I use here to keep my coffee warm, and I burned myself on it this morning, and it hurt. It felt like something. There was a qualitative experience of pain, and I could describe it. I've got a blister on my thumb, and it felt like this, and all the things that hurt real bad for a minute, lasted about 10 seconds, whatever. I would describe all of those things to you. What an identity theorist would have to say is all of those things I just described are literally just events inside the brain. Yes, we have another way of describing them. We have a different vocabulary that we use. But what we're describing, the referent of that language, just is brain states. And that's the end of the story. There is no qualitatively different property. All the things that we describe as subjective experiences are just brain states, and we just describe them in two different ways. We can describe them neurophysiologically, or I can describe them with this mental vocabulary that I have that we all relate to. But there's nothing qualitatively different there at all. I'm just describing events in the brain. I could very well have said, ow, that hurts, my C fibers are firing. And it would have described the exact same thing as I'm experiencing pain right now. So what that tends to do is eliminate or reduce away the qualitatively different mental experiences. In fact, this kind of materialism is often called eliminative materialism because it tends to eliminate the idea that there's something qualitatively different about anything subjective or anything phenomenal. It eliminates the need for that if we can describe all of those things purely in terms of brain states. So that's identity theory in a nutshell. It's kind of exciting because it ties the mind to neurophysiology, and that's been very successful in the 20th century and 21st centuries. But it seems to eliminate the need for qualitatively different mental phenomena and the vocabulary that we use to describe those phenomena. Let's move on to talk about behaviorism. It won't take too long to talk about behaviorism, but this was popular in the mid-20th century as well. The basic idea is this: if you want to define what a mental state is, that mental state is defined by the entire set of all the externally visible, publicly accessible behaviors that go along with that mental activity. Could be really subtle, hard to detect behaviors. It could be really obvious macroscopic behaviors that are easy to detect. But to have a mental state is to have a certain set of behaviors. And again, we can use pain as an example. So what it means to be in pain is to have a complex set of behaviors, things you verbalize, reactions your body has, tendencies you have in the future, habits that you form as a result of pain. It's a very broad set of external behaviors. Again, very subtle or very macroscopic and easy to detect. But the definition of a mental state, according to behaviorism, is to have a set of behaviors. Not a brain state, but a set of external behaviors. In a way, it's better tied to your body. Identity theory tends to focus narrowly on brain states, but behaviorism tends to focus more broadly on our bodies and physiology as a whole. What are the ways in which those mental states are defined by not just our brain states, but the behaviors that our body as a whole has? It's more holistic in that sense. I think you can see the problem with this theory as well. If I say pain just is a set of behaviors, it's me saying ow, it's me withdrawing my hand really quickly when I touch something hot, it's me tending to avoid future kinds of hot things, it's me wincing, all the behaviors that I exhibit as a result of pain. A behaviorist would say that is pain. All of this broad set of external behaviors. A dualist, someone like Descartes, even someone like Chalmers, a property dualist, anyone who thinks that subjective experience is an important part of philosophy of mind is immediately going to say, wait a minute, what about the subjective feeling of pain? Not just that you withdrew your hand away, not just that you said ow, not just that you winced, not just that you tried to avoid doing the same thing in the future, but what about the feeling of pain, the way in which it hurt, the subjective phenomena of pain? There's no way in which that is captured by external behaviors. And a behaviorist would say, well, how do you know about any of that? All you have are the behaviors. In fact, you could arguably say that this is the only information we have, the only insight we have into any other person's or any other life form's mental life at all, is to look at their behaviors and infer what their mental state is based on those behaviors. But a radical behaviorist basically says there is no difference. To be in a mental state just is to have a certain set of behaviors. Unfortunately, I think I think you can see the main criticism of this view right off the bat. It rejects the notion that there's any such thing as a private mental event with no externally manifested behaviors whatsoever. This is an interesting thought experiment. Can you imagine any kind of mental state, any kind of mental phenomena that has no corresponding externally manifested behaviors whatsoever? It's on the one hand, it seems easy to imagine. Like, can't you imagine a person in a room staying perfectly still, not even blinking, having a wide swath of private mental thoughts, a rich mental life, all the mental phenomena that you would expect? Can't you imagine someone being in pain and not showing any physiological manifestations of that whatsoever, but still experiencing the subjective phenomena of pain? A behaviorist would say, no, there is no such thing. Even a person sitting in a room by him or her, wait, I'm messing up the language here. Even a person sitting in a room on his or her own is going to experience some manifestations. In fact, the mere act of sitting in a room not doing anything is a kind of behavior, right? If you're sitting here thinking, that is already a behavioral manifestation of thinking. I mean, the mere fact that I'm sitting here like holding my hand to my chin like this, doing the thinker pose, something as simple as that could be a behavioral manifestation. Even the absence of those can be a kind of behavioral manifestation. Same thing with pain. Even basic physiological reactions, you sweat a little more, your body temperature goes up, or your heart rate increases, all of the even subconscious autonomic responses that we have would be kinds of behavioral manifestations. So a behaviorist basically rejects the idea that there's any private mental event with absolutely no externally manifested behaviors whatsoever. That's a criticism, right? I mean, if you think that there is something substantively unique and different and qualitatively different about our mental lives, you're going to think you're going to hold on to that notion, right? You don't want to define those things in terms of external behaviors. It tends to lose the qualitatively unique qualities of those experiences when you try to define them in terms of physiological behaviors. A lot of us prize our own mental lives. Like I take pride in having some uniqueness to my own subjective mental life. You probably do too. The way I'm artistic inside is different from the way you're artistic inside. And there's some joy in discovering those things about each other. Like we like those things about unique individuals. That's part of the joy of getting to know other people, right? But if all those things are just defined in terms of external behaviors, scientifically that's a good thing because it means we have access to other people's mental states, right? We can experiment on them, and we can, in some sense, maybe indirectly, but we can infer what someone's mental state is based on their behaviors. And of course, the more subtle and the more nuanced of behaviors you're looking for, maybe the more nuanced insight you get into someone else's mind. So there's a trade-off here. Like if you lose the notion of a subjective experience, you lose the qualitatively unique subjective experiences that define you as an individual. They're all defined in terms of external behaviors, a lot of which may be conditioned responses. But it turns out we can experiment and we can do science and we can learn a lot about mental life from those physical behaviors. So it's easy to see, I think, why psychology went this direction. It's easy to see why education went this direction. And I mentioned this last time, but behaviorism really is the philosophical underpinning of a lot of what we do as educators. There's a reason that, we give you guys tests and ask you guys to write papers and do certain things, not just read a bunch of stuff, not just talk about it, but it's very performative. The way I, as an educator, know that you understand is to have you exhibit certain kinds of behaviors. If you can answer the right questions, if you can write papers in the right way, if you can respond to objections, and in lower education, it's if you can perform to a certain degree on a standardized test, then that is the proof that you understand, that you can do the things in question, and that you understand the relevant concepts. But it has to be externally manifested and measurable, quantifiable, in order to know for sure that someone has those subjective that subjective mastery, the subjective state of having knowledge or having mastery over a certain set of material. You can see the problems with this though, right? You can imagine, it's easy to imagine a case where someone really does understand something, but they don't perform well on a test, or they really do understand something, but they're not able to verbalize it because they're shy in a group of people and they can't manifest or exhibit the behaviors of someone who has those mental states. But really they do have mastery and they can do the things and they understand the concepts and they've got this rich subjective mental mastery of the material, but it doesn't manifest itself the right way externally. And behaviorism is always going to struggle with that approach. Test anxiety would be a great example of, someone who's got mastery, but they get nervous taking a test and they don't do well on the tests because for some other social factors, presumably, or psychological factors. it's really hard to draw a certain connection between those external behaviors and the mental states that they're supposed to correlate to. But again, behaviorism even kind of rejects the mental state. What it means to have mastery is to perform well. What it means to have knowledge is to be able to do certain things. What it means to have certain skills is to be able to do certain behaviors. And that's what it means to have mastery or have knowledge or have understanding. They reject the notion that there's this kind of private mental understanding that doesn't manifest itself in some way in external behaviors that can be measured and quantified. I'll let you guys think about the pros and cons of that approach to education. I worry more about the downfalls of that approach to education, wanting to emphasize sort of subjective mental understanding. But the norm in education is to emphasize testing and data and metrics and things you can quantify and measure, partially because that keeps the dollars rolling in, honestly. If you can say, my students are performing this well on standardized tests, keep the money flowing, government or state or the federal education system or whatnot. It's a nice, easy package to keep the dollars rolling in. But I just worry that it's the wrong focus for education. But that is the philosophical underpinning of a lot of contemporary education. But again, I think you can see the problem. Behaviorism, insofar as it defines mental states as external behaviors, which are physical behaviors, behaviors of the body, behaviors of material in the world, physical objects in the world, including our bodies, that rejects the notion that there's anything qualitatively or substantively uniquely mental that isn't defined in terms of something physical. Same problem as identity theory in that regard. And in fact, all of these materialist theories are going to have the same basic problem. Let's turn now to functionalism. Functionalism is a really interesting view that was very popular in the late 20th century. In fact, it still is really popular. I think if you're committed to the idea that there's artificial intelligence, you're probably committed to something like functionalism already. But to understand functionalism, I want you to think back to your high school algebra, or junior high or high school algebra classes. What is a function in its most general definition? I know all you guys took algebra, so.
An action, a thing you know how to do.
Well, a basic function would be something like this. Let me just give you a simple one in algebra. Y equals 2x. That's a function.
Right.
So how does that work? For any given x, what do you get?
Do you mean y?
Oh, either way, actually works both.
Okay.
For any given, if you plug in an x, you get a definite y, right? If the equation is y equals 2x, if I plug in 2 for x, I get y equals 4. If I plug in 3 for x, I get y equals 6. And that's the definition of a function. For any given input, you get a definite output. In fact, that's why in algebra, if you remember, you have the vertical line test to test whether a graph is a function, is a graph of a function. If you can draw a vertical line through a graph and it encounters the line only, the line of the equation only once at one point, you know that's a function because for any given x, there's one and only one y that results. Right, so that's a function in algebra. One input yields a definite output. A different input yields a different output. One and only one output. What's not a function is if you feed an input in and you get two different outputs. If you feed an x in, you get y equals 3 and y equals -3. That's not a function, right? So for a function, you have to have a definite one and only one output for any given set of inputs. So functionalism tries to apply the same reasoning to the mind. Very broadly, you can think of a function as a kind of black box. You feed an input in, some operation happens in the middle, and it spits out an output. Computers are like this, right? For most of us, computers are largely a black box. We don't really understand how they work on the inside. I know a little bit. You might know a little bit. Computer scientists know a lot more. The people who design the bloody thing know a heck of a lot more about what's going on the inside. But what I can perceive are the inputs and outputs. I know the inputs I feed into the computer, things I type, things that I feed into the computer with the camera, all the other inputs that go into my computer. And I can perceive the outputs. Things show up on the screen. Sounds come from the speakers, so on and so forth. It's all just inputs and outputs. The computer is basically a black, mysterious box, right? I don't know how it works. I just know that when I feed certain inputs in, I get certain inputs out. And it's very determined and very precise, right? There's no ambiguity about what the outputs are going to be. If you feed the right inputs in, you set up the computer in the right way, you know exactly what the outputs are going to be if the computer's operating correctly. So functionalists try to apply the same reasoning to the mind. They basically say that what it means to have a certain mental state is to perform a certain operation, just like a function in algebra, just like a black box of a computer. Given a certain set of inputs, the mind does its thing and spits out a certain set of outputs. Now, it's very complex. Like if you take the concept of being in pain or the mental state of being in pain, imagine all the inputs that are related to being in pain. You know, I experienced one of them this morning in burning my finger on my coffee mug warmer. But that's not the only kind of pain. A very complex set of things cause pain, right? Now think of all the outputs that flow from that. Now what's different between functionalism and behaviorism is that functionalism does not limit itself to externally manifested behaviors. Yes, I exhibited certain behaviors as outputs. My hand, flew away from the heat source. I said, ow. I promise not to do that in the future, but I also experienced mental states, right? I did experience certain subjective phenomena as a result of that. Now and maybe in the far future, even memories of it and whatnot. So functionalists are a bit broader in terms of the things that count as inputs and outputs. An input could be a stimulus like a heat source for pain, but it could be a memory. It could be a previous mental state that I had a moment before or a year before. A very complex network of stimuli and previous mental states. All of that goes into the black box of my mind. And then there are certain outputs, certain behaviors, certain physiological reactions, but also future mental states are the result of previous mental states. So a functionalist would say what it means to be in pain is this functional diagram, this relationship between inputs and outputs. That is the definition of pain, according to a functionalist. Even if some of those inputs and outputs are particular mental states or particular subjective experiences. I think you can see the attractiveness of this view right off the bat. It's more complex than identity theory. It's more complex than behaviorism. It seems to allow for subjective mental experiences in the way that identity theory and behaviorism struggle to. You can see why this view arose in the 20th century with the rise of computer science, right? When we start seeing that computers are able to process information, very complex sets of inputs, yielding very complex sets of outputs. People started to say, wait a minute, is our mind really doing anything different than a computer? Aren't we just taking a bunch of inputs in, performing some sort of operations on them, and spitting out a very complex set of outputs? Basically, isn't the brain, the mind, just a type of computer system? Albeit one is made of different material. It's made of gray matter in a brain instead of silicon chips inside a computer. But the principle is the same. You take a certain set of inputs, very complex inputs, perform operations on those, again, in kind of a mysterious black box sense. We don't really understand how the brain is working, how the brain is doing it. And then sorry, I knocked my microphone over, yielding a very complex set of outputs. But in principle, it's the same thing that a calculator does or a computer does, just massively more complex because of the complexity of our brains and the massive complexity of the inputs and outputs that we're talking about when we're talking about mental states, as opposed to solving an equation in algebra. But in principle, it's the same kind of thing. The mind is a black box that takes in inputs, processes them in some way, performs operations on them, just like a computer or a calculator, and various outputs get spit out. So that's functionalism. Let's talk about some of the pros and cons of it. I think one of the pros is that functionalism seems to allow for multiple realizability. And I think you can see why. In functionalism, it doesn't matter how the black box works. What matters is, are you getting the same kinds of outputs when you feed in the same kinds of inputs? This is why my computer gets the right answer and your computer gets the right answer and a calculator gets the right answer, and why I get the right answer on a piece of paper when we're all doing the same math problem, right? It doesn't matter how you do it. What matters is, do you have the right relationship between inputs and outputs? Given a certain set of inputs, are you getting the right outputs? Everything in between could be mysterious, But what a functionalist would say, as long as the functional relationships hold between inputs and outputs, it doesn't matter what's in between. It doesn't matter what the black box is. The black box could be a computer, a massively complex future computer. It could be our brains. It could be alien brains. It could be brains made of carbon-based cells. It could be some silicon-based life form. It doesn't matter what the black box is, as long as the inputs and outputs hold, you've got the mental state in question. So as it relates to pain, it doesn't matter what kind of brain we're talking about, or even that we're talking about a brain. We could be talking about a computer system. If you feed the same kinds of inputs in and you're getting the same kinds of outputs out, for all intents and purposes, that black box, the computer or the brain or the alien brain or the other life form here on Earth, is in pain. That is what it means to be in pain, is to have the right kinds of inputs and outputs. In other words, to have that functional diagram hold in any case. So that's exciting because it allows for the possibility that other life forms here on Earth experience the same kinds of have the same mental states because of, they might have the same input-output relations. It allows for the existence of alien life forms, no matter what they're made of, to experience the same kinds of mental phenomena we do. Maybe, maybe not. We don't know. It's to be determined, right? Astrophysiology is in its, or astrobiology is in its infancy. Computer science, it allows for the possibility of artificial intelligence. If we can develop a computer system that is complex enough to accept all the inputs that humans do and spit out all the same outputs that humans do, then that computer system would have, according to a functionalist, have the exact same mental states and would be genuinely conscious, would genuinely be in pain, or genuinely be self-aware, or genuinely have intentionality. So really, I think if you believe in strong artificial intelligence, not just that computers can emulate consciousness, but computers can be conscious in some way, and can have genuine mental states, you probably have something like functionalism in mind. I think another advantage, like I mentioned a moment ago, is that functionalism allows for private mental experiences. Part of the inputs and outputs that functionalists believe in, excuse me, aren't just externally manifested behaviors. They think that the inputs and outputs can be other mental states. For example, in our last class session, I used the example of getting a cup of coffee. I make a decision to get a cup of coffee, get a desire for coffee, then my body goes and get a cup of coffee. And a little bit after that, I'm feeling satisfaction, right? I'm feeling, I've got my coffee now. I can feel its effects on my mind, right? I feel more lucid now after a cup of coffee. So there's a kind of input-output relationship purely about mental states, right? My mental state said, go get a cup of coffee. I had some physiological, maybe addictive need for coffee. I knew it was going to make me more awake if I had a cup of coffee. Then what are the outputs? My body went to get a cup of coffee, but part of the output was also experiencing a future mental state, the mental state of, I'm satisfied now, I've got my coffee, and the future mental state of being more lucid and thinking more clearly, being able to express myself more clearly. All of those things are part of the very complex web of inputs and outputs when we're talking about functional mental states for a functionalist. So it's easy to think very simplistically about functionalism, feed a simple mental state in and get a simple behavior out. But functionalists really hold that the web of inputs and outputs that define any given mental state are massively complex, more complex than anything I could represent on a screen. In fact, you can see how down in the weeds you get really quickly when you start talking about the different inputs that generate a mental state and the different effects that flow from a mental state. Massively complex network of inputs and outputs, which is why, presumably, simple computers like my iPhone or my iMac in front of me, or even a supercomputer, are not adequate to account for the complexity of the inputs and outputs that define our mental states as humans. It's an order of magnitude, several orders of magnitude more complex than any computer system we have now. But in principle, a functionalist would say, and a proponent of artificial intelligence would say, once we do develop computers, no matter what they're made of, whether they're silicon-based computers or some sort of quantum computer that's all the rage nowadays, once we get computing to the point where it can process massively more complex inputs and outputs, then maybe computers can have genuine artificial intelligence, not just replicate artificial intelligence, not just exhibit behaviors of intelligence like machine learning theorists do, but genuine artificial intelligence, computers or their future descendants that are qualitatively conscious. They have subjective experience and experience the same mental states we do. So those are some of the pros. It's very promising. I think you can see why this was a promising view in the late 20th century as computers got faster and faster and faster rapidly. I mean, in a very short amount of time, computers I mean, there's a whole law for this. If you're in computer science, you know the law. It's called Moore's law. The notion that the processing power of CPUs, central processing units, seems to double every year and a half. And historically, that's been true. It's still true to this day. Every year and a half, the processor speeds seem to double. And that's amazing. I mean, that's an immense amount of growth. We're talking about exponential growth now. So at a certain point, computers, if that trend holds, computers may get to the point where they can process the same complexity of inputs and outputs that we do. Hence the people who believe that artificial intelligence is genuinely possible, if not now, then at some not too distant point in the future, if that trend continues. So what are the weaknesses of functionalism? I think the obvious weakness is that it's still not clear at all how subjective awareness arises from even the most complex functional state you can imagine. Take any degree of complexity, a bunch of complex inputs and some very complex set of outputs. No matter how complex you make that diagram, it's not clear at all why that black box in the middle experiences subjectivity and phenomenal awareness, right? The phenomena of consciousness, not just processing power, not just yielding a bunch of outputs, but why does subjectivity and consciousness arise from that black box? So functionalism still struggles to explain the thing that we want from consciousness. We want to understand why consciousness arises and why consciousness emerges. And functionalism is still kind of by definition struggling to do that insofar as it emphasizes merely inputs and outputs, not subjective awareness. It's also seemingly unable to account for the qualitatively different nature of mental states and mental properties. You know, again, what is it like to be in pain, to feel pain, to experience pain? Yes, I can talk about the inputs that cause pain. Yes, I can talk about all the external behaviors and my future mental states, but the in-the-moment qualitative experience. In fact, philosophers have a word for this. It's called qualia, the subjective experience of something. Not just its description, not its scientific description, not its behavioral manifestations, but its subjective experience, the item of experience of pain. It's unable to account for why that subjective experience of pain seems to have these qualitatively different properties than all of the related behaviors and all of the related inputs and outputs and all the related physical descriptions of pain. There's a subjective experience of pain that seems qualitatively different. And again, functionalism struggles to explain why those subjective experiences are qualitatively different than all of the physical substrates that underlie them. And you can apply the same thing to a computer. Like if it turns out that a computer at some point in the future can be conscious, if that computer is having subjective experiences of pain, that subjective experience of pain is so different from all the qualities and properties that make up its physical substrate, its silicon chips and its printed circuit boards and the electrical impulses that make up the relationships that make the computer work, right? The experience of pain is so different from those things. And likewise, the experience of pain is so different from everything going on inside our brain at a physical level. It's different from my neurons. It's different from electrical impulses. It's different from complex physical structures in the brain. It's different than all the behaviors I manifest. So why is it so qualitatively different? And this is the kind of thing we were talking about last time with property dualism, the thing David Chalmers wanted us to pay attention to in thinking about his zombie thought experiment, imagining that a physical system can operate on its own, but have no mental manifestations, no emergent mental phenomena. But the fact that we can imagine an example like that, like right now, my computer is doing its thing. I don't have any pretensions that my computer is conscious, right? It's not aware of what's going on. It's just crunching numbers. But presumably, for me, I'm not just crunching numbers. I'm not just processing inputs and outputs. I'm experiencing, I'm feeling, I'm perceiving, I'm aware. But that is so different from everything that makes up my brain and so different from everything that's going on inside a computer. It's not clear at all how functionalism answers that problem. A deeper problem is that it seems to preclude the possibility of free will. Functions are deterministic. Given a certain set of inputs, you have to get a definite set of outputs. That's the definition of a function in algebra or in computer science or in functionalism and philosophy of mind. So if it turns out that being in pain just is a certain type of inputs and outputs, but what about things like intentionality or making a decision? Having autonomy or agency over your own life? A functionalist would have to say, well, given a very complex set of inputs, what yields your decision is, the set of outputs that you have just is the functional relationship between inputs and outputs. Where is there room for free will? Where is there room to be able to have control over what outputs you have? Where is your autonomy in that situation? It all seems very deterministic, and maybe it fails as a philosophy of mind, at least as a desirable philosophy of mind, if it precludes the possibility of having any control over your own life, control over your future mental states, control over your future behaviors. It's all very deterministic. It turns out that could be true. Maybe there just is no free will, and anything that resembles free will is an illusion. But if we want to hold on to the notion of free will, this can be a criticism of functionalism. I want to talk about one of the key objections to functionalism that's not on this slide. It's on my next slide. But are there any questions at this point about what any of the three main theories are, identity theory or behaviorism or functionalism, or any of the advantages or disadvantages of each of those theories before we move on? Only have a few minutes left, but we can do this in 5 minutes. Okay, nothing heard, so let's move on. Oops. There we go. So the last thing I want to talk about is not something that was mentioned in your reading, because it's really easy to explain and easy to understand. John Searle is a philosopher of mind. He's contemporary, he's still alive. Many years ago, he thought of this thought experiment that's called the Chinese room thought experiment. And the experiment basically goes like this. Imagine you're in a room and you don't speak Chinese. You're not a native Chinese speaker, that you know nothing about speaking Chinese or reading Chinese or understanding Chinese. But on the table in front of you is a rule book on how Chinese works. For any given set of inputs, what kind of output would you get to be able to comprehend Chinese? So for example, and we do this in linguistically all the time. If I say, hi, how are you? You say, oh, just fine. There's a kind of input-output relationship to our linguistic practices, right? All languages have a rule book like this. What kinds of things count as valid arrangements of symbols and valid responses inside that language? Computer languages have this. Natural languages, ordinary languages, foreign languages, all have this quality. There's a grammar to them, right? So imagine you're not a native Chinese speaker, but you do have this rule book, the grammar rule book for the language. And there's, on each side of the room, there's an opening. There's an input opening and an output opening. And in the input opening to the room, someone passes you a Chinese symbol or a string of Chinese symbols, a statement in Chinese. What you're allowed to do is go to the rule book and look up, boom, 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 boom. Okay. Given this set of symbols, here's what a valid output in the language would be. And you basically scribble that on a piece of paper, or type it up, or whatever means we do in the 21st century, and you pass that through the output hole. When you're first learning to do this, it's going to be really clumsy, right? It's going to take some time. I got to look things up in the rule book. Now imagine you do it over and over and over and over again. So much so that you don't even have to consult the rule book anymore. You take the input in, you know exactly what a valid output would be. I think what the heart of this thought experiment is this question. Even if you get really, 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 really good at processing inputs and outputs to the point where you don't even need the rule book anymore, do you understand Chinese? What do you think?
I think you'd have to some degree.
Oh, you understand the grammar of Chinese,
Right.
right? You're giving the right kinds of outputs.
Right.
But do you have semantic understanding? Do you understand what the symbols mean? What they refer to? Arguably
I would
not.
think
If you have, If you have no reference even to your own language, I mean, this is the beauty of putting it in
Right.
Chinese, right? If you don't even understand what the symbols mean, you don't even understand how they correlate to your own language. All you're doing is taking an input and processing an output. You can't, there's no semantic understanding connection to anything you do understand. But I think John Searle's point is that if you get really good at this, you can be functionally indistinguishable from a genuine speaker of Chinese, right? You can be so good at it that you can't distinguish those outputs from the outputs that a native speaker of Chinese would give. Maybe you'd even be better at it. So let's analyze what computers do now. Computers process inputs and outputs. What John Searle is saying that even if you get the fastest computer you can imagine, to the point where the responses of a computer are indistinguishable from the responses of a human being. All the computer is doing is still just processing inputs and outputs. The computer takes a certain set of inputs, churns away on them, and processes and yields a certain set of outputs. No matter how good a computer gets at that, no matter, again, even in the far future, imagine not just today's supercomputers, but quantum computers and the thing that comes after that in computing. No matter how good computers get at processing inputs and outputs, they will never have understanding. They will never have semantic understanding. In other words, there's a distinction between what's called syntax and semantics. The syntax of a language is the grammar. What kinds of things count as valid arrangements of symbols or valid utterances? What kinds of things count as valid responses to someone else's set of utterances? That's the syntax of a language. The semantics is the meaning. What does the language mean? What do the terms refer to? What, either objects in the world or metaphorically. That's the meaning of a language, right? And the meaning of a language is distinct from its semantics, is distinct from its grammar. So what he's saying is that computers, all they do is process things syntactically. They process the grammar. They take inputs and they spit out outputs. And even if you get really, really, really good at that, that doesn't mean that the computer will have semantic understanding of what it's doing. So he's giving an in-principle objection to artificial intelligence. He's saying that even the most powerful computer you can imagine will never have subjective experience, never have subjective understanding, and never have the kind of consciousness our human brains seem to have. In other words, our brains are not merely processing information. Our brains, for some reason yet to be determined, in neuroscience or otherwise, our brains seem to not just process information syntactically, but we also have semantics. We have understanding and meaning and awareness and consciousness of what we're doing in processing the information. We're not just merely taking inputs and spitting out outputs. It's a deep criticism of functionalism. It's saying that functionalism is dead wrong. That our brains have some other qualities besides the input-output relationships that make up these supposedly functional diagrams of mental states. John Searle, basically, in asking what is consciousness, he basically said consciousness is not a property of anything other kind of system besides brains. Brains have consciousness. Computer systems don't. Computer systems can emulate certain things that our brains do. Our brains do process information and yield outputs, but that's not all our brains do. Our brains also seem to have consciousness and subjectivity and semantic understanding in the way that computer systems don't. We're going to pick this up next time when we talk about emergent properties and non-reductive physicalism, because an interesting answer might be, well, it sure seems like, given the complexity of our brains, qualitatively different phenomenon, qualitatively different properties emerge out of complex structures. Given the structures in my brain that have some lower level physical properties, yes, they process inputs and outputs, yes, but they also seem to yield qualitatively different properties. And if you look at the history of the cosmos, its evolutionary history, from the Big Bang through the formation of galaxies to planets to the formation of life here on Earth, at every turn, it looks like new properties and new phenomena, qualitatively different phenomena, seem to emerge out of simpler things that came before. So if you're open to the idea that qualitatively different properties can emerge out of complex arrangements of lower level physical properties, then maybe you can develop a computer system that is complex enough where not just it processes inputs and outputs in the right way, but where it yields the same kind of emergent properties in the same way that our brains seem to yield emergent properties that give us things like subjective experience and consciousness and semantic understanding. But that's a topic for our next class. We're going to go ahead and end here. If there are no more questions, we'll go ahead and end here. Are there any questions on anything we've talked about? I know we've gone over a couple minutes. I'm sorry I'm doing that lately. It's just, I could spend another hour talking about all of this, but we'll pick it up next time. If there are any questions, now's the time.
I think it makes sense. Like
okay. Let's go ahead and wrap it up. So next time we're gonna talk about emergence and what's called non-reductive physicalism. The idea that there are emergent, not physical properties that are qualitatively different from lower level physical properties, but are not reducible to those lower level physical properties, and some of the philosophical advantages and disadvantages of that approach to philosophy of mind. I hope you guys have a good few days. I'll see you guys next Tuesday. Have a great weekend.
All right.
Have a good day.
Thanks. Take care, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.